Excellent. Thank you, Josh. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our webcast today. My name is Carol Caughlin, and I use the pronoun she, her. I can comfortably speak for the entire team who've been part of developing this perspective, that we are thrilled that so many of you have taken the time to join us today. Thank you very much. I'd also like to highlight that we released the paper on National Persons Day, and that today's webcast falls on both World AIDS Day and the start of the Universal Human Rights Month. These calendar events help us to remember where we have come from, recognize our progress, and highlight how much more we have to do. This paper is targeted at that last point. It's not all-encompassing, but respectfully, we believe it's part of how we can move forward. So let's jump into it all. To start, I'd like to acknowledge that our offices reside on the traditional treaty and unceded territories on part of Turtle Island, North America, which we are home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge that the traditional owners of the land on which our Chilean offices sit, and pay our respect to those owners past, present, and future. A couple of housekeeping points before we get into the conversation with our fantastic panelists today. First of all, this conference is provided by Deloitte Canada, and it's intended to provide some general information only. The content is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. If you have questions for us, and I do hope you do, please send your questions to the Q&A window below. Jake in the background will be moderating and helping us organize those questions. And I will absolutely promise we will hold time at the end of the webinar for those questions. In addition, this webinar will be, and I think you're all notified as you joined, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be archived to be able to be viewable afterwards. Finally, for those of you who prefer to listen to today's webinar in French, live French audio translation is available through the Zoom platform by clicking the interpretation button and selecting the preferred language icon. We have translators in the background who are there to make sure we provide that service for you folks. So please partake as you choose. As I mentioned, we released our paper on November 1st. And we're really, really excited. I can't tell you how excited we are that so many of you have joined us to discuss this report. Equity-centered design for government services, seizing the opportunity to get transformations right. We're excited to share this report with you, not only because we got the most downloads and registrations for an event in quite some time from a Deloitte perspective, but more so because it comes from working with so many of you, public servants. It actually all started when we were doing work with a leader in one of the Crown corporations around DE&I strategies for her organization, specific to the workforce. And she rightly asked us to push our thinking and their thinking, and to quote her, "Okay, consultant, this is some really good work, but there has to be more. We need to do more. We're being challenged to do more by RPM." Combine that with some work we are doing with Paul and his team around enabling digital transformations across the federal government. And the idea started to germinate. Then we were actually testing the idea with one of the provincial ministry CEOs, to which she loved it, and then said, and additionally, it's fiscally responsible. It's fiscally responsible for us to really think about the system we want to be designing as we are modernizing the system. So I can truly say that this paper comes from working across the levels of government. And thank many of you who made those quotes to me today are here today. So thank you. But additionally, this is very much where this came from. And what we like to do today, as we look at the slide, and I am getting to it, Jake, I promise. We're going to intro equity-centered design in the context of government, discuss how we can integrate systemic change with systems modernization, and engage in a discussion around how and when you can integrate it into the great work that you are doing in providing services to the residents of Canada. So let me introduce the panelists that I've joined by today. First of all, let me introduce Paul Wagner, Deputy Chief Information Officer of Canada and Treasury Board Secretariat. Paul was named Deputy Chief Information Officer of Canada this past October and continues to lead the strategy and transformation team within the Office of the Chief Information Officer, OCIO, of Canada. In this role, he takes on responsibility relating to horizontal strategy and planning management for the Government of Canada's digital portfolio and additional accountabilities in representing digital priorities globally for Canada. Paul brings 3 decades of private and public sector experience in information and digital technologies to the executive table. Paul has previously served as Chief Information Officer for Justice Canada, Library and Archives Canada, and the National Research Council of Canada. He has overseen operations and innovations in the areas of digital service delivery, information technology, information and data management, and partnership management. I can also personally attest to Paul's passion for providing services to the residents of Canada for enabling governments to move forward at pace. I'm also joined by Dr. Sarah Reid-Morris, who leads Deloitte's innovation and customer strategy practice. She brings deep expertise in ethnographic methods, strategic foresight, and inclusive product and service design. With an emphasis on the public sector, she helps clients imagine, design, deliver, and scale products, services, experiences that balance what is desirable with what is practical and valuable. Prior to her work at Deloitte, Sarah helped establish Canada's first regulatory nudge unit at the Ontario Securities Commission. She earned a PhD in sociology at U of T and holds a postdoc from Rutgers School of Management. Her work has been published in HBR, The Behavioral Scientist, and the Journal of Health and Social Behavior and Work Occupations. Finally, myself, I'm Carol, as I introduced. I have the honor of serving clients across the public sector, focusing on modernization, transformations, always with a focus on enabling people. After 25 plus years of experience in imagining, enabling, doing, and leading transformation in large bureaucratic organizations, I can say that I've never been so optimistic as to what we can collectively achieve in service to the residents of Canada as I am now. So let's jump into our questions. So to start, Sarah, I'm going to put you in this. I'm going to, before we jump in, actually, Sarah, in our prep for today's session, folks, what Paul, Sarah, and I agreed to is this is kind of a kitchen table conversation versus a hardcore Q&A moderated session. Frankly, because this is a maturing topic. This is not one that's fully baked and that we have all the answers to. So it is one where we hope that you can partake at our kitchen table, but also it's a sharing and learning from that perspective. But Sarah, first start us off. Help us understand more about human-centered design and equity-centered design, most particularly, of course. And we know that tech transformations need to be human-centered to be successful. But help us understand a bit more about what we're talking about today.
Sure. Thanks, Carol. And Carol and Paul, great to be having this kitchen table conversation with you all and folks joining on the line. It's great that there's been so much appetite around something that is critical to our country. So thanks for making the time on this Thursday morning. So equity-centered design is really the practice of purposefully including marginalized and underserved communities throughout a design process with the goal of allowing their voices and lived experiences to directly affect the solution that will address the inequity at hand. So that's sort of in general what we're talking about. The ethos here is really that folks with lived experience are best positioned to inform what good design should look and feel like and how it should actually be implemented practically. So practicality is actually going to be a core theme here as well. It also seeks to limit bias across the design process by considering how systems of exclusion have historically caused many communities to be overlooked. So here's the thing. Systems operate exactly as they're designed to. And so we know that bias is built into systems, right? And so we really need to be relentless about how historical systems of exclusion have become almost hidden in government processes and structures, not because of any bad intentions, but because of inertia and orthodoxy. And so we really need to leverage equity-centered design, which is great at starting from a position of questions asking why, bringing context in to the equation from the outset so that we don't unwittingly reproduce inequalities that we're trying to address. That's the sort of goal here. As you mentioned, Carol, for sure, equity-centered design processes, as well as us humans, are constantly evolving as we continue to learn and understand from each other. And so, we're on a journey, the government's on a journey. I just want to be clear about, about that. And this is a practice. But it's really also critical to understand that the process and experience of designing in equity-centered design are as important as the outcomes that process produces. So it's really about recognizing that inclusive and equitable relationships are sort of the design requirements of transformation. You simply can't make systems and transformations that work for a lot of people that you don't understand, at its core. So, and quite practically, you can't achieve transformation if you don't have broad adoption. And so that's sort of what equity-centered design means in the context of government, but also in the context of government transformation.
Very cool. Thank you. I think we could unpack that one for hours. But Paul, let's come to the kitchen table, my friend.
Sure. You said it was a kitchen party. Like I was thinking, like a down east kitchen party. Bring out the ugly stick, maybe a few libations. This is a little different. We'll go with it. We'll go with it.
It's 11 o'clock in the morning here in Toronto. We're almost at the weekend, almost there. From that perspective. So as Paul, you've been on this journey with us for a number of months as we've been talking on this around this topic, and of course, many more years around digital transformation from a government perspective. As you're bringing those thoughts together with digital transformation in government and equity-centered design, where do you think some of the places within government are really leading this charge, and you're leaning into and watching for some of those growth areas that are just talked about?
For sure. And yeah, I saw some emojis when I talked about kitchen party there. So please, folks on the line, first of all, welcome, 198 of you. Great to have you around this extended kitchen table. Feel free to use emojis. Let us know what you're thinking here as we're talking. And you obviously have the opportunity, as mentioned before, to post your questions and so forth. There we go. Love it. And yeah, love all the different shades of the thumbs, right? I mean, that's a great example of human equity-centric design, before all the thumbs were beige, and that's not what Canada looks like. So awesome to see that. So look, honored to be at the table here with you folks and have the conversation around equity-centered design. When Carol first talked to me about this and pitched the idea, and I actually printed I still have a printer, printed the report out. I think one of the things that the report does, and I'll talk about government in a second here, but is it raises the dialogue to the right level. In the past we've talked about human-centered design, and that's when you think about, well, if as the humans use the technology, have we actually set it up correctly? When you hit the tab button, does it go to the right place? Does it kind of, does it make sure that you're filling in the right types of forms? Can you use it on Android and iOS? That's great, but that's incredibly myopically technology focused. And for me, one of the things I love about digital and what that term means, and if you can think of a good iteration of a Trojan horse, digital allows us to unpack things like service, like technology, policy stat, all the stuff Sarah talked about, all of those preconceived and certainly in the case of the Canadian federal government, decades old, and in some cases centuries old mental models that have led to the service delivery paradigm that we find ourselves in today. And so digital allows us to transform some of those things. I don't actually like the word transformation. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think what you've done is you've taken the dialogue from being about technology and thinking about, does the technology meet the need? And you've raised it to a service level. And I think that's really where we need to think about the way that we deliver services to Canadians. We just published a digital ambition in August of this year. And if you hop on the Canada.ca website, anybody from the federal government in the digital space probably has already taken a look at it. But a couple of key things in there, if you unpack the language, it really comes down to establishing and reestablishing, and in many cases maintaining trust in government. And it talks about service delivery. It absolutely talks about technology and what we need to do to adopt cloud and become agile, but it really focuses on a service narrative. And as we're going around and giving the presentation around digital ambition, one of the things we say, doing digital government in a digital age, our government creates the conditions for trust for its citizens. And when we say citizens, and I'll call this one out as well for myself, we're talking about Canadian businesses, and those looking to come to the country. And I'll talk about immigration as part of this narrative. But I think, as we think about equity-centered design, those that are coming to the country, and some of those folks, coming from, war-torn countries, some of those vulnerable populations on the planet, we need to think about what a service needs to look like for them as well. But there was a really neat quote that we got as we were building out the digital strategy from an economist at the University of Chicago, Luigi Zingales. And he said, government has a unique opportunity to engender trust in people. The government's role is to allow people to trust so that they can worry about doing everything else in their life without feeling insecurity. And it takes generations to build that. And I thought that was a really kind of, really important quote for today. And thinking about, as we design services, and I'll talk about digital standards and all that stuff later on, where we kind of ensconce this type of thinking and this type of evolution in what we're doing, the dialogue is changing, and it is becoming, more service focused. Since we've established, those digital standards that are part of every new service design that we have within government that is digitally enabled, and finding one that isn't. Departments have to adhere to those standards, and those standards are going to evolve. And I think part of the dialogue today, and part of the questions and the back and forth that we'll have with folks today will help to shape that as we move forward. But I can say that like I said at the beginning, the work that Deloitte has done here in terms of raising the dialogue, I think is a really, really important piece, and looking forward to getting into the meat of it here.
Very cool. I may have to snag that quote from you. That's a pretty amazing one.
Sure.
That was great. And so let's recognize that we are in the art of the possible, because to your point, this is an evolving space, Paul. What do you think are some of those building blocks that both the federal governments and then additionally provincial and municipal governments and Crown Corps, et cetera, need to really think about as not only they're embarking on their digital transformation, which I know you've done a ton of work around, but taking the opportunity to get it right, and baking in, and to your point, raising the level to the services that all folks need. So what are some of those building blocks you think that need to be put into place?
I think one of them is professional humility. The recognition that it's pretty easy for a bunch of people to get into an echo chamber and design a service, design a system, and say, yep, that's exactly what we need. And I mean, we can point to a bunch of those things. I'm going to say ArriveCAN. Probably shouldn't. So ArriveCAN and a bunch of other, COVID alert and a bunch. And some of those were done well. Some of them weren't. And I know Sarah will probably, she'll call it some of the things where maybe there were some missteps, and we need to hear those. But digital leaders in the government, in governments, need to have the professional humility to ask those, ask the tough questions, get into a place of discomfort. I mean, I'll go back to, I don't want to become a quote generator here, but I'll go to your report. Okay. So this one's from you guys. So it's not, but it was one that I think was really kind of, it engenders what we're talking about here. And it says, equity-centered design is about bringing context into any modernization initiative. From day one, you're asking questions about yourself, important, your own personal biases and so forth, institutional orthodoxies, history, relationships, situation-specific needs. Again, all about context. It's complex, nuanced, and often arouses discomfort, and that's the point. The point that it's comfortable to sit in that echo chamber and design a service. And so for me, the cornerstone of ECD is professional humility, and thinking about the users. We've oftentimes, and if you look at any of the legacy systems that we have and legacy services that we have in place today, that some of them still literally in policy talk about faxing documents in. If I'm not mistaken, I think there's still a Transport Canada policy that pilots or airlines need to fax it's not funny. I saw that emoji go by. It's really not funny that we still have the word fax, that we have the word fax in a policy document. But that shows the kind of, I think, courage that it's going to take to be able to stand up to those policies, some of which are decades old, and challenge those things. Because if you think about, if you're designing services for immigrants, and Canada's got an ambitious agenda to welcome 500,000 new immigrants a year, we need to think about what the service looks like to them. again, as I mentioned, these are vulnerable people, and it would be very easy to say, well, here's the policy, here's the program requirements to become, naturalized, and so build a system that meets that need. And we've always been very much internally focused in terms of how we build systems. The systems match the policies, probably, with a high degree of confidence. But we haven't done that around the user experience. And I think, and it's hard to imagine going up to, someone who's looking to come to the country, potentially with their family in tow, they're from a war-torn country, and say, so how would you like to be served, right? I mean, but I think we need to find ways, either in process or post-process, to get that kind of information. And those folks, when you look at the number of months it takes in the case of immigration, 15 months, I think I looked just earlier, like if you're coming from India and you're a government assisted refugee, it's 16 months, give or take. If you're coming from Kenya, it's 39 months. So if you take those standards, and those are published, standards that we have on the IRCC website. If you take those as given, whether or not we agree with the processing time, the one thing that someone looking to come to the country would want to know is, look, I put my submission in, where am I? Something as simple as that. And I can say, IRCC is working at developing tools and systems and thinking about that with users, designing with the users, in terms of trying to resolve that issue, because it's, the processing needs to be resolved. We need to think about how we actually expedite that. But as a first step, as a first foot forward, how do we make sure that the systems and that we have in place, I don't mean technology systems, but the processes, the service standards that we have in place, how do we make that transparent to users so they understand where they fit in the overall system? So I would say courage and humility are the two biggest things there, Carol.
That is amazing. And I completely agree. It takes a lot of courage to look at a system that is decades old, if not, and say, we need to go back to fundamentals. We need to change our lens completely. Now, Sarah, I'm going to pull you into the kitchen table, because I know you're like itching to get in. But you've done some phenomenal work working with community groups that traditionally have been very hard to get access to be able to get the sort of insight that Paul's talking about, and to break down the echo chamber. Can you share a bit about those experiences?
Sure, happy to. And I just wanted to play on some of Paul's commentary before diving into that, in terms of the IRCC example. I love that one as one that Deloitte's been deeply involved in as well. And I think one tendency that we need to really buck is that we're just designing for individuals when individuals don't experience their lives that way. And so really thinking about designing for ecosystems, in particular when you get into equity, and thinking about what are those ecosystems in which people belong? How do we need to be designing for that level? That actually gets at community capacity building and not just individuals. And so, the beauty of digital in particular is that it can do that, right? And it can do it well. But we need to just stop treating, a see one, solve one as if individuals don't live their lives in connected ways. And digital transformation can actually design for connection. And that's when human beings really, really thrive. And so, in the immigration example, we know there's a huge ecosystem of supports and networks that are really critical resources for folks going through the process. And so that's an opportunity, right, to leverage that both in sort of the design of the process, but just in the, in terms of the technical, application process, but also in terms of who else needs to be involved and enabled in that process to make it a good experience. Carol, talking about, getting access to, underserved communities and doing that well, and working a lot with Deloitte and our public sector partners to do that. I think, Paul, and you mentioned some of the standards changing and sort of what that needs to be. And it's really, it's good that we're at the point where we're not trying to drive demand for this, where there's at least a recognition and a standard or a set of standards where we're talking about what is service modernization? What does it mean to take an outside-in perspective? And so really sort of leading with that as defining what is good in the context of good government, and not just tech transformation. And I think some of the tendencies that I've seen some of our government partners fall into that might tend to get in the way of taking an equity-centered approach is sort of, I guess there's sort of three that come to mind, that get in the way of good intentions, because that's the base here, right? Like we're in the era of good intentions, but I think one in the context of transformation in particular is there's an operational bias or a near-termism that tends to come in the way. Like there's no doubt that transformation is a huge investment, right? From government, there's a lot of pressure, therefore, to sort of get to quick wins, proof of concepts, showing what this investment was for and making it work. So because of that, there's a tendency to actually move to solutions quite quickly, move to the build, right? Let's get there, or coming in with a sort of a sense of what is that solution entirely. And equity-centered design actually applies enormous pressure to that tendency because it really starts from a place of why. And what questions, which are by design exploratory questions, as opposed to how questions, which are more operational in nature. So exploratory questions really, to your point, Paul, of like starting with at the right level and having the right discussion, that is about exploratory questions, about context, and they're intended to get at root causes. And that takes a bit of time, right? That feels uncomfortable in and of itself, and folks lose patience. But I will, it's really about, move slow at the beginning to move fast later on. In the context of transformation, I think is really important to sort of zoom out and understand the bigger picture. Because if you understand what is the right problem that we're solving before you invest in any of the, technical build and solutions, you have a greater likelihood of actually achieving adoption, but also critically reducing the risk of reputational and technical debt, which are not great in the context of good government and transformation. I think the second thing is, and Paul, you raised this, is there's a tendency to conflate transformation with technology, and technology is an enabler, of solutions of transformation that really need to solve for human needs. So when we fail to prioritize what we call sort of desirability, so like what needs to be real and compelling, for the people this solution is in service of, we run the risk of, having an adoption issue. So we can make anything technically now, right? And that's usually really not the problem. But the problem is making sure that the technical feasibility is matched and balanced with what is desirable from a human needs and context perspective. And then, of course, what is required to meet the mission of government. And so I think in teams, in transformation teams, those capabilities need to be showing up, right? So it can't just be tech leading what's happening here and defining, what is an MVP, but really balancing that. And that's that tension, right? Those are hard trade-offs and tough conversations to have about what needs to actually be true for people to feel included and to actually use this service as intended. How are we going to pull it off technologically? And then, what needs to be true in terms of, the back end of government. And it's really sort of that balance that we need to get right. And, leading with a technology first perspective is already off balance. And then I think third, and this is really key and where, we've in particular worked with government clients, is there's a lot of discomfort, and you raised that, Paul, with engaging with residents, in particular residents with more complex contexts. And that's for a variety of reasons. One, it might be perceived as too hard. Two, it might be perceived as really risky. Three, you lose a sense of control over a process. And that's all required to do this right. And so, I said it before, but we really can't make things work for people for whom, we don't understand. And so the best way to start to do that is bring people into the equation from the beginning to make sure that you're getting the right problem and you're getting the right context in, so that, not, again, you're getting the desirability, but you're also starting to build in practicality from the get-go to say, like, what actually needs to be true, not conceptually, but practically speaking, for this to be implementable And you do that through, co-production and co-design. So this is really, this is not consultation where we're sort of saying, hey, what do you think? And answer yes or no, at the beginning and say, okay, we figured it out. Now we can go build the thing. It's really flipping that on its head and be much more porous end to end and say, we're showing up as collaborators or co-producers in a process together to define what needs to be true in order for this to work. And that is scary. That sounds like sharing power, right? And so, we can't talk about equity if we're not also talking about power, right? And really, flipping the model sort of upside down to say, how do we need to behave and collaborate together to make really awesome things, that bring all of Canada forward into the future, not just some.
Yeah, so Carol, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in here. We need a talk rock or something. Listen, I couldn't agree more, sir. I think you're spot on, and I do think, we often talk about multidisciplinary tables for transformation, and I hate the word transformation. I'll tell you why in a second. And we used to think multidisciplinary meant you need technology people, you need program people, but now we need sociologists, we need behavioral scientists, we need people. Like, back to my humility point, that are able to go out into the community, understand, sit with real users. And in some cases, that's sitting with homeless communities, that's sitting with Indigenous communities, it's sitting with, like we talked about, people looking to come to the country. And it's having the ability to do that. And to your point, it's not consultation. It's not, well, I checked with them, and so, I put that check mark, and so my submission can go through because I've done my consultation. It's about saying, you know what, we're going to get it wrong, but to get it together, we're going to get it righter. And that needs to be an evolution. Here's why I hate transformation. So transformation to me means that you've taken your eye off something for so long that you actually need to transform it, as opposed to evolving it. So I'll use some examples, and anybody who's in Ottawa, you can give me the emojis. It's a great, so everybody had to react to the pandemic. There's a great restaurant here in just outside of Canada in Stittsville called Next. And here's where we'll see if the emojis of all of the people in Ottawa. And I happen to know the chef there. I've known him for decades. And he, has a big restaurant, had to shut down, obviously, when the pandemic hit. And, he was thinking of different ways to actually evolve his business model. I mean, he didn't put it that way as we were having a glass of wine talking about it, but he shifted to create these things called global tables. And it was basically a meal in a box. You got a bottle of wine, you got all kinds of food. He had a video that showed you how to finish the food. You felt a little bit like a chef while you were doing it. And he kept his business going. In fact, his business increased by having that small little shift, that pivot to this service delivery model where you didn't go to the restaurant came to you. And he kept, now, we're sort of somewhat post-pandemic. He's keeping that going along with his original business model, which is you show up with a bunch of friends, you go to the restaurant, you have a great time, and you go in there for an experience. He evolved his business model. He didn't transform it, he evolved it. For me, transformation, and when I look at some of the major transformations we have underway today, I'll use our benefits delivery modernization, which Deloitte you're involved with, and many. I'm sure there's a few people online here that are involved with that as well. We're looking at an old age system where, sure, the proper technology that's underlying it is relatively stable, but it's 65-year-old code. Like, it's old enough to apply for old age security. So that's a problem. That means we've taken our eyes off of it, and no fault to the public servants, because we've had governments that have had incredibly ambitious policy agendas that have basically said, we need a new program for this, we need a new program for that. And we stood these things up on the back of a technology that did create, Sarah, to your point, technical debt, but also constrained us in our ability to actually think about equity-centered design, because the technology that we're using, even if we did come up with the right model from a service delivery perspective and thinking about some of the different communities that we are potentially not serving as best as we should, technology is not going to let us get there. So I would love to see us, everybody online, my challenge to all of you, and if you want to throw some questions out or comments about how you don't think this is realistic, is how do we build into what we're building today, not project, not outcome for the project, but long-term enduring evolution of the programs and services that we're talking about, so that, equity-centered design, as it comes in, as that becomes, clearer in terms of a focus area, it's not, well, we have to transform our services to align to ECD. We evolve our services. And I think as we design our services moving forward, we need to build this in. There's a great ad I used to, back when I used to get magazines, used to get Wine Spectator magazine, loved Wine Spectator, it was great. It's a huge, big format thing. And I'm getting nostalgic. I'd love to get one of those again. But there's an ad in there that I was always impressed with, and it was for a watch brand called Patek Philippe. I'll never own one. Maybe some folks from Deloitte might be able to. Certainly not from the public service. But these are very expensive watches, and their moniker was, you never actually own a Patek Philippe. You're only taking care of it for the next generation. And so I would challenge all the leaders on the call today to think about their roles in that space of, you don't actually own the product, service, position that you're in today. You're taking care of it for the next generation. And what are you going to do? And in this case, we're talking about equity-centered design. What are you going to do to make sure that that type of design framework and that type of humility in service design gets built into the overall service frame as you move forward? So anyway, probably nowhere near any kind of question or thought that you had, Carol, but I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Go have a kitchen table. You never know what's going to happen. And part of, as we were producing the paper, a lot of the comments we got back was, this is phenomenally practical. Thank you, folks, for starting to pull this apart. And you can see how this crew is starting to pull us apart. But I want to get even more tangible, because for those of you who know me, I'm obsessed with pragmatism and all those sorts of elements. So completely agree. We need to design to enable evolution and design for the future and 7 generations and all of that. And frankly, technology is now at a place where it is not the governor of that. It is our bravery and our courage and our creativity. So what does some of that look like, though? Part of what I love are the stories around how, when we had the privilege of doing some not-for-profit work, by the way, Paul, we don't always follow that perspective. But we worked with a homeless youth shelter. And Sarah and her team, you trained some of the homeless youth to be able to go and be that consultative voice. And not only, of course, building skills, but more so you're getting honesty and transparency. Because yeah, a whole bunch of suits walking in and asking questions and answering a checklist, be they consultants, be they internal, you're not going to get it. It is about how do you start getting that information, and then how do you build that into your design? But more so, because we all have seen good design get shrunk as the initiatives went on. How do you keep it going? How do you keep it measuring? How do you keep measuring that you're getting those outcomes of actually that you started doing? And that's part of where, frankly, you don't do the thing at the end where you toss it to accessibility testing and it comes back and everybody argues if you got the right color, whatever. It's actually part of the design that is perpetually being tested and woven in. But Sarah, I'd love for you to talk a bit about, like, as we're going through these processes, what are we looking for? What are the measures? What are, like, how do the folks who are picking up the challenge that Paul just laid down going to actually track and trace this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll be honest. It's an evolving space, and as we're all learning, we're building in. It's deeply reflexive, and that's part of good equity-centered design. Is we're in it, right? To your point, Paul. Humility. We are the humans. Together and trying to figure this out and co-produce it. So, one other thing, Carol, because you mentioned some of the work and a lot of our approach, and you'll find that this is going to come up in my response here. And Paul, you mentioned trust, and especially with folks who've been historically overlooked from design or completely left out. There's a trust deficit, and so what does it mean? Right, to do this work in those contexts. And a lot of what we do, and Carol, you raised one example in real time, but we've been replicating this across other contexts. Is we typically don't have the trust in that community. We are unknown. And these are folks who have gone through sometimes multiple different types of traumas. And so the job to be done and the priority of equity-centered design is leading with safety, right? And of the people and the communities in that process. And it's saying what needs to be true in terms of who should be going about, engaging in this process. And oftentimes it's not us, nor should it be, right? So just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think it's, again, when I was talking about ecosystems, it's really engaging the ecosystems in which communities reside and what are those support networks and where does trust live, and leveraging those and building relationships there to understand, how do we need to understand what the problems really are so that we can solve them as a collective, as opposed to this consultative sort of process. So, that's one way we've been doing it. Again, it requires, giving up control, figuring out how do we do this, not trying to be perfect. It's prioritizing safety and the relationships over, sort of this perfect, assumed process to get there. And so, again, why I said the process of equity-centered design is as important as the outcomes it produces. And that's one example of doing that well. I think, in terms of, when we talk about measures, it's really about being much more expansive about how we just define success. And it's sort of taking an outside in and an inside out perspective simultaneously, I would say, over time. So it might sound like, and we've built these into some of our own work, do folks from underserved and marginalized communities see this as a success? That feels like a very basic question, rarely asked. And of course, including what success needs to look and feel like from an outside-in perspective in your valuation, right? So that's going outside of the organization into a community to say what needs to happen here. And going, and letting the community define what that actually means for them. Very different. Triangulating, of course, quantitative and qualitative measures that don't just track things like adoption or uptake, which are absolutely important to understand, use, but also experience. What does it feel like? Right, which is more qualitative and getting, again, sort of at the things that might not be obviously quantifiable there. And then also capacity building. Were you enabled? Right, those are different sorts of very human types of questions that are really important in an equity context. And then also critically, inside out. Change starts with us, right? And so we are in it, and we need to build in those accountabilities and sort of reflection points so that we're growing over time. And so that's both about sort of what is our accountability as people doing, stewarding some of this work, but also what is an equitable process and how are we tracking it? In this last one, we did some work with the provincial Ontario government around social assistance modernization. And before we even started the engagement, we developed a series of what we called inclusion principles. And we used those to define, again, sort of almost as a check and balance to say, when things get hard or we enter that it's too complicated conversation or a deadline, we were holding ourselves accountable. And we agreed to this with the client and us doing the work. And so that sounded like, do we have representation from a diversity of voices and lived experiences? If not, we don't hit go. Did we structure our research to create safety for participants? If not, we're not ready. And again, we build in that reflexivity. So I think that made our research process better because we made different decisions about saying, it's not appropriate for us to be doing this. We need to partner. How do we need to develop those relationships? What needs to be true there? So, those are some examples of measures and sort of maybe guardrails that we've used sort of very practically speaking to make sure that we're, to your point, not waiting to the end to figure out if we did it right, but that it's building in reflexivity and gut checks continuously through the process as we grow and evolve and learn.
Yeah, just on that point, I think, every service is a human service, right? So, ultimately, we talk about technical services, digital services. Ultimately, every service is being, provided to a human, and whether that's to, a Canadian business or to a citizen or, to someone looking to come to the country. We may facilitate it, using technology, which is totally awesome. But in the end, and for a lot of the marginalized communities that we're talking about, it does become a human-to-human service. and the technology. And so, you know, a lot of time when we think about, you know, the design of services, many cases there may be intermediaries for those services. Those intermediaries could be, you know, call center agents. So ESDC, great example of that. Ton of services, and they're designing, thinking about some of the most vulnerable populations, some of the aging populations in the country, those that are unemployed, and you know, so some of the ones that need the most social assistance. And so, you know, this is a very, very strong focus for them as they design services. And in many cases, you know, it's thinking about that intermediary being the call center agent and thinking about the kind of technologies he or she has at their disposal to deliver those services. But in other cases, those intermediaries are, you know, community associations. And so, you know, we were talking recently about, you know, the use of digital credentials, thinking about, you know, how could homeless people use digital credentials? They're not walking around with one of these. And so, but they do have an identity. They do have biometric. They have trust, back to the trust narrative. They know they need government services. They may or may not trust the government services, but there's a trust ecosystem in many of those underserved communities through some of these community associations. And so how do we think about, you know, those types of groups where we think, as we design services, how does it work for them? And I think that's it's a powerful, you know, sort of example for me to think that we often think about the individual, the one person, and the one person that's got access to the technology that we're talking about. They've got the Wi-Fi, they've got and that's, sure, there's some of those, but we can't design services only focused on that. And I think the other thing that it forces us to do is, you know, in government, we have Westminster system, we've got, you know, very vertical mandates. That's not how services are consumed, nor how services should be designed. And I think what you're starting to see is, without breaking down the Westminster system, I'm not going to suggest that digital should do that, but it's certainly going to break down some of the service paradigms that we've traditionally held in how we deliver services. Certainly, the passport, situation that we had this summer, where, you know, you've got multiple departments involved in the delivery of passports, and, you know, you saw the lineups and ministers, you know, standing in those lineups trying to get a sense of what's the experience, what's the lived experience of Canadians. We have work to do as a government, and I think a lot of governments do, in terms of turning the dial from program and policy to service. And I think that's something that, that quote, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, it takes generations to build that trust, and that trust gets built up from the work that we need to do within government. You know, hopefully we're not talking generations here, and we're talking years and you know, maybe a decade, but we've got to turn that dial to service. We can't forget the program and policy. I mean, that to me, the trust element of our service deliveries is predicated on having the right policies and programs in place and so forth. And I mean, you know, the governments change, programs change, but our ability to react to those, to react to changing contexts in the world, COVID, inflation, you know, world conflict, and our ability to adjust programs, but still maintain a service delivery experience that Canadian businesses and others look to have. I mean, I'd love one day for Deloitte to run a survey around service experience, and the government of Canada be at the top of there with maybe the Royal Bank and a couple of Amazon and a few like that. To me, you know, we all strive to be, you know, one of Canada's top 50 employers. What about being one of Canada's top 50 service providers? That would be, you know, a feather in the government's hat. You know, stop there. Thanks.
That is a fantastic challenge. Folks, we're having some great questions come in, and so please keep them coming in. For those that we don't have an opportunity to answer, we will incorporate some answers via the webpage. The folks will tell me how we're going to do that, but we will do it from that perspective. But I want to jump to one that we got from Peter. He starts out saying, "Thank you for the kitchen conversation. Lunch, and by the way, he's all keen to go for lunch at Next." Sarah, I appreciated your examples of whom to include and how to include them through the ecosystems. And he's looking for specific examples of those aha moments that came through your inclusive design approaches. Where were some of those, like, oh, that's a change your thinking, aha moments?
Yeah, look, it's a really, really good question. And I'll be honest, I wish I had, a boatload of good examples about excellent ecosystem design, but I say, we're sort of at the beginning. But let me give you a really simple one. We were collaborating with the ESDC, and this is many years, this is pre-benefits delivery modernization actually. And we know that OAS, as designed so far, is you've got to opt in and you've got to enroll and do all of this kind of stuff. And it's a confusing process, and we can't make assumptions about where older Canadians are in terms of what resources they're bringing to the table. And so we started with the research, understanding again, what are the people, where are Canadians, older Canadians approaching OAS, what sort of lives are they living and what are their contexts? And we found, lo and behold, a lot are supported by other folks in their care networks, whether that be professional, family, what have you. And so our big aha through doing that research and understanding, again, people in context, was saying, what we actually need to do is design a toolkit for them so that they can understand how to support their person through this process. And so again, by understanding how are people living their lives and what are their support networks and what are their actual circumstances, and how do we enable the system to support that person who needs to be enrolled, we designed a toolkit exactly for that. That was, available through different community associations, available online. It still exists actually. And so again, a really simple example, but when you change, when you go from individual to network, it really does shift in terms of like, what are we designing for, and what, in terms of thinking about the resources and the distribution of those, again, which is an equity question, so that everybody's entering, ideally the situation with the same level of resources to participate.
I think the one that I would layer on that, frankly, many of the folks on the call today will have been key to, and it happened at multiple layers of government, was the thought process that went in behind vaccinations and having people from all different communities choose to get a vaccination. Recognize that some that choice wasn't primary, but vast majority of Canadians chose to get a vaccine. And the thinking that went on at the municipal level, at the provincial level, at the federal level, to me was palpable, and a real big shift in that, because we needed people to make a choice from that perspective. I think that's part of what we're looking to say bring in here. Now I've got one more question that we can take today before we've got to wrap up, because I promised everybody we get them out on time. What the question is around, frankly, really appreciating the talk but curious as to how affected communities are being consulted in equity-centered design in government and being empowered to take on leadership roles. So shifting from being consulted and kind of being engaged, and to your point, Paul, not creating an echo chamber, but also like, how do we actually help people, or I shouldn't say help, enable people to take in those leadership roles? Thoughts from around the table?
Sarah, you want to start off?
Go for it, Paul.
Oh, okay. We have lost Sarah.
Oh yeah. No, I think I lost you, but go ahead, and then I'll pile in over.
Yeah, I think, so we're starting to do it with a lot of services, and it's interesting as you're going through the examples, Carol. One of the things we have to be careful of as well with some of these communities, although I'm sure a lot of them are kind of like, you're coming to ask me about the design of services. Wow, and they're probably pretty happy to actually even just be asked. But in true government form, we're going to do that 160 different times. Or maybe 260 different times. And we're gonna go to the same community and say, so what do you think about that? And what do you think? So I think, one of the things that we need to do is create these long-term relationships with these communities. And I would say we've done probably the most of that in the Indigenous communities today, where we have very strong relationships. So, you prove a vaccine as an example. Ton of work was done by 5 or 6 departments in terms of, okay, so how are we going to set up this proof of vaccine credential, working with the provinces, thinking about international, what that looks like. And there was an Indigenous community engagement strategy, not by province, not by department, but for that. And, you know, I think, and we were able to engage with them in a very effective way. And I think those learnings need to be built upon for future services. And you know, those relationships, like I said, with Indigenous communities, I think are probably one of the stronger ones that have been built. I think we need to do that with other community organizations and community groups, and ensure that within government, we're sharing that knowledge. So they're going to take a leadership, and we'll give them that space to be a leader in terms of service design for those communities. But the quid pro quo from the government perspective is we're not going to ask you every single time. We're going to take the learnings and we're going to share that. Now, back to my Westminster model, we're not good at doing that today. We've got to find a way to do that, share those learnings. Like I said, we've got the digital standards that talks about designing, with users. And I mean, one of the aligned behaviors, if you look at that, is the team is, developing and testing systems with a wide range of users and so forth, diverse backgrounds. Great. And the way we have it set up today around, I'll bring it back to the metrics conversation, is if I did that, if I followed all those digital standards for the service that I'm building, I get a check mark. Well, that's so good. But now how do we actually work horizontally? How do we share those learnings horizontally so that we're not starting with a blank sheet of paper for the next service that's getting designed, because we'll never get there. So I think there's leadership. I think we need to give the space for the leadership. That's starting to happen. And we need to, as we work with these communities, take the learnings from one community to the other. But then also our responsibility is, from a government, is to share that internally. I don't know, Sarah, any thoughts on that?
No, Paul, I love that. And I think it's like this sort of, sensing and scanning, function should be a capability inside of government, right? Like you're not building, it's not, it's moving away from a program perspective, to a much more like an ecosystem, it seems to be the key word, but exactly, I hear you. It's about sort of understanding, human needs and context. Yes, they will be applied to a particular program, and to understand that sort of, that process and experience, but human needs are much more evergreen than that. Right. And so we can find out a lot about people by spending a lot of time with them, as just a capability of core good government, and having that as a domain, that is sort of informing. And then one other thing is, some folks, municipally, a lot of folks that work more in the homeless sort of space and housing and are doing this Maitri and the like, but they have lived experience committees being assembled all over the place. And that's sort of saying, this isn't a committee that's going to just advise and be collaborate on one sort of program. This is a committee that we're assembling who are going to partner with us. Avoiding the C1 community to say, we're partnering and we're going to be with you, in a longer term relationship where you're having a leadership role, you're compensated, it's a real job. Your lived experience and your participation here is work, and it's going to be recognized as such. And so I think that's a really important and inspiring construct that we can start to sort of think about taking up and then scaling.
Excellent. So I need to jump in here, folks, as somehow the moderator also means a timekeeper. We could keep talking forever to the point where the kitchen table became a kitchen party, so with the fun instruments and all. But we want to respect everybody's time. Folks, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for bringing this forward and to starting to really broaden this conversation. For all of you who joined us today, and we had the pleasure of seeing you and you are leaders in this space. Thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled that you're here and having this conversation and frankly picking up the challenge that we put forward and making it go further. And that is always amazing. So thank you. As we've mentioned throughout this conversation, we believe this is part of how we change the system to be the one that we want in a sustainable and fiscally responsible way. This is just the start of this conversation. It's an evolving approach. We're going to need to put equity at the forefront of this work for residents of Canada to be able to participate in the services that you all want to provide to them. It is a start, and so thank you. We look forward to continuing on this trajectory with you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Happy December 1st. Thank you all so very much.